Good morning. We have a large studio audience here, and I imagine a larger virtual audience. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. The event we're bringing today is not just an Atlantic Council event. We're doing this in cooperation with the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, as well as the Ukrainian World Congress. And we have excellent panelists today. Immediately on my left is Andrei Futi, who's the president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. To his left is Nico Longa with Munich Security Conference and a great expert on military affairs in Ukraine. And to his left is Hannah Shales, who also works with us here at the Atlantic Council, a renowned commentator, expert on foreign policy in Ukraine. And to Hannah's left is Kurt Volker, probably needs no introduction, former ambassador to NATO for the United States, former senior representative for U.S. policy towards Ukraine. And to his left is Anna Wieslander, who is with the Atlantic Council based in Stockholm. So we're going to look at what happened at the NATO Summit, what might come forward in the future, from the perspectives of all the nationalities represented here, meaning the United States, Sweden, Ukraine, and Germany. So I'll start with Anna Wieslander. What is your assessment of the outcome of the NATO Summit? And please, 3-4 minutes.
Thank you so much. Well, I think if you take into account that the guiding principle in preparing this summit was expectation management in order for NATO to stay united, the result of the summit is decent overall. I think there were some progress made in important areas on deterrence and defense, for instance. But when it comes to Ukraine, yes, short term, a stronger signal than in Vilnius that NATO is supporting Ukraine, but major pieces still missing. And one is, of course, the invitation, which would have provided the long-term framework for Ukrainian integration into the Euro-Atlantic structures. And the other one is the long-term collective pledge that NATO should have done to support Ukraine militarily. And then you can add perhaps the third dimension, although that is not NATO, but that is to lift the restrictions on how to use the long-range missiles, especially given the attack on the hospital on Monday. But that kind of is not part of the NATO agenda in that sense. So for my part, when I came to Washington, D.C., what I was missing already, I knew it wouldn't be delivered. That was the invitation to Ukraine. I think it is a mistake. And the other one is that the NATO should have provided a 3% pledge for defense spending to 2030. Because even if we see that there is a lot of talk about increasing defense industrial production, which is very necessary not only for NATO's own defense, but also for the support of Ukraine and for that whole chain to work. We are 2.5 years after the full-scale invasion, and this is still not working. We are still not producing, and we need to put increased pressure on that part as well.
Thank you very much. Hannah, the same question for you from a Ukrainian perspective.
You know, it is definitely better than we would expect, but it is worse than everybody really needed. And be honest, we didn't expect any invitations because after Vilnius, it was clearly and understandable that in Washington, we would not have it. Election year, all other reasons, and also because no victories on the battlefield. So we didn't have the arguments. Besides that, definitely NATO membership became the only security guarantee for Ukraine. So the question was for us when we've analyzed the results of the summit is from two baskets. The basket number one is what Ukraine actually got. And here it is not only what is in the final declaration, but also what is in the communique after the Ukraine-NATO Council, and there are much more details there, much more involvement, at least pledges for these. Definitely in this basket, our main question will be, okay, all is this nicely promised, how it will be implemented? because after the 2.5 years, we know that we have a lot of announcements, a lot of pledges, and then only 50% of the delivery, of the actual delivery on the ground. That's why now the question is, from all those nice statements that we heard during the 2 days, what would be implemented and how quickly. But then definitely we followed very, very in detail and closely what NATO is doing for itself, because that is important for Ukraine, where we are going, what type of NATO we are expecting. And that is not only 3%. Yesterday, it was one wonderful phrase during the public forum. It's not only how much you spend, but how you spent it. And the question for a lot of Ukrainian experts and military, for sure, is if NATO is ready for the same speed of the changes and developments as the threats are developing, as the adversaries are developing, and as the needs after the Russian invasion in Ukraine demonstrated. So it is not only nice statements, but what is in the space, because we already see it there, what it is with the cyber, what it is with other partners, how it is the readiness, what is it with China, what it is with Iran, what it is with many other stuff. And that is not least important for us, because when you speak about so-called military Schengen, it's not called like this within NATO, but we're discussing these variants. That is important for Ukraine as well, because that means how quickly a lot of that assistance can be delivered for Ukraine, for example. Of when you speak about the joint production, industrial-based standardization of the military production in NATO, that is important for Ukraine as well, because otherwise we would not have these discussions that Sweden would like to provide us with Gripens. We say no, because it is totally different base that we need for this. And we feel bad, Sweden feel bad about this, but that is reality. You cannot invest in everything. So that's why now it is the time for the very close and particular analysis of all other articles beyond what where Ukraine is explicitly mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Andriy, as the president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, you've been very active promoting closer U.S.-Ukrainian cooperation and American help in the war. Your judgment on the summit as well, and also, what were you doing, what was your organization doing in the run-up to the summit, looking for specific outcomes?
Thank you, John. I wish there was a word in the English language that took into account 3 words: disappointment, frustration, and just complete confusion, bafflement. We're at a stage that, we just saw 3 days ago, 4 days ago, what Putin does to civilians, to children. And it's just a very big disappointment. We all knew, we did not expect that invitation to come. But the fact of the matter is that the actions speak louder than words. Kind of want to equate it to a football game. The community is getting very tired of being a football between NATO and Russia. And what's happened is the NATO team has brought Ukraine to the goal line. They've called all the right plays. They brought in the right players. But they get to that goal line and they just don't want to score that touchdown. It's either they don't call the right plays then, or they make a fumble, or they have a penalty and they take a step back forward. So from that standpoint, the community, quite honestly, has to be told, is disappointed. The UCCA, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, are communities around the country. This is not something new to us. We've been working on the NATO issue since 2008. This started back in 2008, so it's been an ongoing program. But basically, this was a grassroots campaign. We had our communities actively involved in terms of advocacy, not only meeting with their members of Congress on a bipartisan basis here in Washington, but even more importantly at the local level, working with the local media. We held joint webinars, with joint conferences, joint events with you. We also formed a very strong coalition. Right after the summit in Vilnius in Lithuania, we formed a working group with our partners in the Central and Eastern European coalition, our Polish, Baltic, and other friends. This was an effort in terms of working with them and engaging their communities. So this was not only an effort by our Ukrainian American community, but it was an effort by all we speak louder when there's 20 million of us rather than 2 million of us. So the fact of the matter was, there was a lot happening. There were rallies held around the country. The same occurred in the 32 member states, countries around the world. So the one thing that we are looking at. If you remember correctly, right after the Vilnius Summit, President Biden said, 1 hour and 20 minutes after hostilities end, Ukraine will be a NATO member. Well, you got to give Ukraine the tools to end this thing. We're tired of the bridge. What is a bridge? A bridge is a target. A bridge can be blown up. And we have to make sure that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, and we're going to continue working on the invitation for the next summit.
Okay, thank you. Nico, we'd appreciate your view of the summit and the role played, in your judgment, by Chancellor Scholz and his government.
Well, I cannot say very much about Chancellor Scholz. I'm afraid there is a big contradiction here. I think Chancellor Scholz is very happy with the result of the summit, and this is exactly the problem. But let me just briefly make 3 points. First, this NATO summit for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian leadership marks the end to a sequence that was very intense diplomacy and very intense meetings throughout June and July. The Normandy meeting, the Ukraine Recovery Conference, the Conference for Peace in Ukraine, in Bürgenstock in Switzerland, the G7 meeting, and now the NATO summit. Except the NATO summit, I would say all the meetings I mentioned, they brought tangible results for Ukraine, and they brought results that will help Ukraine going forward. But the sequence of events now will pose the question to the Ukrainian leadership, and I think to all of us supporting Ukraine, what's coming next? What are we working towards? What are the goals to achieve? I think that's a very important moment now to come up with some new ideas how to move forward. My second point is this NATO summit. I mean, I know about expectation management, but just because the expectations have been managed, it doesn't mean that the policy decisions were right. I think they were wrong. I agree about the bridge. Nobody wants to live on a bridge or under a bridge. It has been wrong from the very beginning. And I think that should be said clearly. And keeping Ukraine in the same position since 2008, basically, to say, yes, you will be a member of NATO, but we will not tell you how and when. And the conditions are met when we decide that the conditions that we are not telling you are met. I think this puts Ukraine in a very dangerous position. And if we have understood one thing from the last years, then it is that gray zones need to be eliminated. So that is a missed chance, and I'm afraid the strategic decision to invite Ukraine to start membership accession talks is a part of achieving peace. So this sequence of events, first achieve peace and then NATO, I think it's wrong. Bringing Ukraine into NATO, it's an element of achieving peace. So we have to continue working in that direction. I saw a very frustrated Jens Stoltenberg at the public forum, where he expressed that he was very much in favor of moving forward, but I think he mentioned 3 times in his speech, no consensus. And unfortunately, no consensus was a metaphor for the US and Germany being at the forefront at blocking the right strategic decisions. So how to work on that and how to convince them, I think is very important to move forward. And then my last point, there has been something developing in parallel, which is not NATO, but is indirectly involving NATO. And I think that has been a good development, and it needs to be built. We need to build on that. And that started with the Kiev Security Compact, with the G7 declaration in parallel to Vilnius, and now there are 23 bilateral security assistance agreements. I know that the Ukrainians like to call them security guarantees. It's more a framework for security assistance, but I think this can be developed into something tangible, really helping Ukraine to use 23 countries who have signed these agreements now to equip the Ukrainian military to move forward with the modernization of the structures, to get away with obstacles that are there for security cooperation, for industry cooperation, technology cooperation, all of that. So implementing those agreements and moving forward to NATO, I think that could be something that we all could catalyze in the months going forward. Last point, the unity in NATO was very important to preserve. But at the public forum, for example, I saw leadership from Baltic states, from Scandinavians. I did not see any German government representative there. I did not see a French government representative there. So working on bringing the Germans, the French, and others up to speed with the Baltics and the Scandinavians, I think could be a good effort.
Okay.
John, if I can just
Please.
make one phrase.
Please.
Because everybody concentrated only on the breach, and that is definitely awful wording. I mean, they needed to find something better. But reading attentively, there is still a huge step forward compared to the previous in 2 words. First, it is the word irreversible. Why it is important? Because you need to put it in the context of the last 2 months. And last 2 months, we heard more and more, again, like a déjà vu, that NATO membership of Ukraine can become the bargaining chip in negotiations with Russia. So putting it in the final declaration with the word irreversible, it seems to me that it is the certain security guarantee from not making it the advantage, good card for the Russians for the beginning of the negotiations. I understand that any of the wording in the political declaration can be changed afterwards, but still that was the very serious signal that in Russia they noticed. We followed like how they reacted. And the second is, for the first time, we heard not only the word Euro-Atlantic integration, because it was irreversible path for the Euro-Atlantic integration. Integration is the process. It is the process that can be with different ends. But it was said, and membership in NATO. And that was already a little bit better than what we had in the previous. So we understand that it's very painful and all this consensus, but at least this one sentence already became much better than what we had in Vilnius, for example, and it was much more explicit in terms of the membership, but not just the process.
Thank you. Okay, Kurt, your views are well known about the need for quick Ukrainian entry into NATO. One, what is your reaction to Hannah's analysis on both of those points, as well as how do you weigh the weapons package against the less than sterling results on NATO-Ukraine at the summit?
Right. Well, thanks, John. And let me start off saying I share Nico's assessment, and I admire Hannah's optimism.
If I would not be optimistic, we would be dead.
And I think, let me just start to answer your question by saying we need to stop and look at the big picture. We have the most serious, largest war in Europe since NATO's founding, since World War II. It's been going on for over 2 years. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. And just this week, Vladimir Putin attacked a children's hospital in Kyiv, and Medvedev goes on Telegram and says their objective remains unchanged, which is to eliminate Ukraine as a nation, as an identity, as a people, as a language, etc. That means the risks of this imperialist genocidal war continuing and expanding are significant, that we may be facing a smaller war now than we may face in the future. So with that as the background, people coming to this NATO summit had 2 questions in mind. What's the strategy for winning and ending this war? And what is the future of American leadership, which was put on the table by our presidential debate? Here we are after 3 days of people being in Washington and talking, and the same questions are still there. What's the strategy for ending the war victoriously? And what's the future of American leadership? Nobody can tell you. So we have not risen to the challenge of our time to deal with this major war in Europe. So that's the bottom line. Now you can look at all the details that have been brought up. And I would argue that they're fairly insignificant details. What's a bridge? Who knows what's a bridge? Is the use of the word membership good? We've used the word membership for 16 years. The question is there an invitation or not? And there's not. The weapons package, it's great that we're providing 5 more Patriot systems to Ukraine. But if you listen to the president's remarks on Tuesday, he very clearly articulated the Putin problem. He said, you have Putin that wants to destroy Ukraine. and he's not going to stop. And so our answer to that is 5 Patriot missile systems. That's not up to the level of the challenge that even the president identified. So we simply haven't done those things. As for membership, I think Nico said it very well. Our objective, you know, when NATO was founded, let me start with that. The idea was to prevent future war by committing to collective defense and deterring any aggressor. That failed. We now have a major war in Europe. We didn't have attacks on NATO allies, but we are suffering the consequences of a major war in Europe that we did not prevent. And now, as we look at Ukraine and NATO, we have to think, first off, winning the war, but we also have to make sure there's not another war. And the way to do that is to embed Ukrainian membership in NATO as part of our building that peace for the future.
Okay, thank you. All right. I'm going to ask another round of questions, but then we'll have time, 15, 20 minutes for audience Q&A. So people here in the studio, ask for a microphone or raise your hands. And people online with us, you can connect at AskAC, AskAC is one word, .org, to submit questions. All right, Anna. The NATO Summit is building on last year's decision to establish the Ukraine NATO Council, where the Ukrainian ambassador can directly interact with their NATO colleagues. But it's worth noting that while Sweden and Finland were waiting to become a member of NATO, its ambassador participated in the North Atlantic Council, right, the NAC. Some skeptics see this as, therefore, a tentative step towards Ukraine's NATO membership as opposed to a strong one. And some cynics think that the policy of at least some prominent members of NATO is to reflect Zeno's paradox, where the arrow constantly gets close to the target, but never actually is meant to reach the target.
Well, this goes back to I think it's correct, actually, in a way I try to explain it. It goes back to my point on invitation. Now, look at NATO. NATO always says that, you know, we survived, we can celebrate 75 years as strong as we are because we are able to adapt. And that is because NATO is just founded on a treaty which is like 3 pages long or something like that. And the rest is just pragmatically a possibility to adapt to the circumstances and remain strong. Now, taking that into account, an invitation to Ukraine, I knew as well that it wouldn't come, but I still want to push it because NATO can do this the way it fits NATO. It's not that there is given from heaven how this process should be taken, and that leads me to how Sweden and Finland were treated. Now, we issued an invitation, and the expectation was that we would join within a month or so. That was basically how it was prepared, a very, very fast track. Now, that didn't happen. It took almost 2 years for Sweden. But meanwhile, we were still able to be treated as allies, basically. We were not part of the nuclear planning group, but that was basically the only difference. So, and this is not written anywhere in the stars. This was good for NATO because they wanted Sweden and Finland as integrated as possible. It made NATO stronger. And I would argue, given what my panelists have outlined here very elegantly, Russia is a long-term threat to Europe. Even if Ukraine settles with Russia, Russia will remain a threat to us. And that's in official analysis of Sweden, for instance. I'm here to give a Nordic perspective. It's shared by the Nordic countries. Ukraine is just a reflection of a much larger problem which Russia conducts is to Europe. And given that framework, I think NATO should be much more flexible and creative and issue an invitation, set the framework for Ukraine, and then we work along for Ukraine to fulfill the criteria. They are doing that in parallel with the process of joining the European Union, so that's like a no-brainer to me. And then just integrate them more. Yes, they should be at NAC. I think that's obvious. Yes, you should work as we did, hook into the graduate response planning, increase interoperability while preparing and so on. So you could do that within the framework.
Thank you. Hanno, weapons package announced at and around the summit was important. But also important was the strike on the Ukrainian Children's Hospital and other facilities, the day before NATO convened. There's an old Russian phrase, they say something is not a coincidence, comrade. And by that, I cite that here because Putin chose to do that as a way to undermine the summit, to demonstrate that Ukraine is not protected by NATO. Just as 10 years ago, before the first NATO summit after Moscow began its war in Ukraine, the day after Obama visited Tallinn to reassure our Baltic allies that we had their backs as Moscow was conducting a war on Ukraine, the Russians kidnapped an Estonian intelligence officer from Estonia. The day before the NATO summit, the day after Obama was there. This is exactly the same ploy. RADA Speaker Stefanchuk in Washington on Monday cited this and said it's critical that the U.S. remove all restrictions on Americans' weapons used to hit Russian targets in Russia. Within hours of that, John Kirby, the White House spokesman, said no change in American restrictions on their weapons use in Ukraine. I interpreted that as a Putin victory, a tactical victory. So I'm mentioning that now for your reaction, but I want to add two more pieces. Yesterday, at the public forum, Jake Sullivan said, and I'm pulling up my phone so I can give you the exact quote, but of course it's now locked, so I'll wing it. He said something like, "We are working closely with our Ukrainian friends for a decisive response to this." Fine, sounds good, after what Kirby said. But then, not much later, President Biden, speaking publicly, when asked about the use of American weapons, says, well, in a roundabout way, it's logical that we look at this on a day-to-day basis, which seems to be saying, well, maybe nothing's going to change. Your reaction to the combination of a reasonable and actually even in some ways impressive weapons package alongside the habitual Biden administration timidity in the face of Russian provocations?
You know, probably as the educated people, they're just afraid that we will destroy the architectural heritage of Moscow. But otherwise, you know, there are several issues in this, and that is definitely the full-fledged diplomatic game when somebody is trying just to cover their backs. Because Ukraine has already been striking with Ukrainian weapons the territory inside of the Russian Federation. And we saw that there haven't been any type of the escalation, because everybody's afraid of so-called escalation. I still can't understand what is inside of this escalation. But we targeted Moscow several times with the drones. We targeted already dozens of the refineries around Russia. We targeted in St. Petersburg in the port. We targeted Novorossiysk port. So that's already been no reaction. I mean, just the regular reaction as it's been. So, and no reaction from Washington that, no, you did something wrong. That was absolutely okay. The problem is in the use of the US weapons. But then I'm just remembering for myself these 2.5 years, you cannot use HIMARS even for 40 kilometers. No, that is so dangerous, that will be escalation. No, you cannot use this type of the tanks. No, you cannot use ATACMS. That will be something very dangerous. So each time we received no to something, and then we just needed a little bit more efforts and time to use it. Unfortunately, these time and efforts means lost lives of the Ukrainian soldiers and civilians. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that this no is categorically no. The question is how we can put arguments. We already have one step forward that we are allowed to shoot near Kharkiv and Sumy, at least some of the regions. And then there is these vague phrases coming from White House that, and in case of necessity, we are not supporting, but Ukrainians can decide about their targets. So I think that the real green light would be what type of the ammunition we are receiving. Because that's understandable if it is the ATACMS with the certain range and with the certain explosions or some other types that can reach those targets that we need. That means the green line. Because even before, if you had for 40 kilometers, not for 160, that was understandable where you don't want it to find itself. That's why we already see these longer ranges. We see no opposition to the Ukrainian weapon strikes. You see more positive statements from the United Kingdom, for example, or from other countries, feel free to use our weapons. And I think that we will come with the US. The question is that we will definitely, probably at the first stage, need the clear coordination and proof that, okay, with this particular missile, we are going to target this particular airfield in Murmansk, and don't be afraid that we are targeting Mariinsky Theater or the St. Basil Cathedral.
All right, just then to conclude on this specific point, I agree that the pattern has always been the United States says no, 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 and finally says yes. And I agree at some point we will give permission to use the ATACMS against targets in Russia. But you're not saying you believe it's happened already. You're not saying you believe right now Kiev could strike with ATACMS 150 miles into Russia and we're going to be okay with it. Am I right on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
I'm afraid that before November we will not receive this
Right.
permission.
Okay, fine. All right. Next question. All right. Andriy, your reaction as well to the whole issue of use of American weapons in Russia, the fact that we are still saying no even after the hospital strike.
Allow me to make a comment on wording in the word irreversible.
Please.
Nothing will be irreversible if there's no Ukraine tomorrow.
Amen.
That's the key in all of this. As to, I just want to refer to President Zelensky when he spoke at the Ronald Reagan Institute. He made the plea very clear. They needed the capability to strike from 150 to 500 kilometers because that's where the current bombings are coming from, those airfields, and they need to hit those particular airfields. So in terms of the priority of the UCCA and in terms of the priority of our community, in terms of what we're going to be advocating for over the next couple of days, weeks, and months, number one priority is to have no restrictions and to allow Ukraine to strike within those particular distances. I just want to use a quote here, and this is a direct quote from Speaker Johnson when asked the same question 2 days ago, and I quote him. I stated that the will of Congress is to provide them with the flexibility to use the weapons and aid we've already set so they can conduct war as they think is necessary. And I think the Speaker is right in this particular moment. And the fact is that those restrictions have to be removed. And if I may just quickly end in terms of priorities, the other priorities that we're going to have as a community UCCA is secondary sanctions. Is going to be, again, removing the restrictions in terms of allowing Ukraine to strike, designating Russia as a state sponsor of terror, and something nobody wants to talk about, but I think it's something that we already began, is in a lame duck session, what's going to happen with the next supplemental? Is there going to be a supplemental? And the fact of the matter is the community is going to be actively engaged in trying to make sure that happens.
Do you want to give us a prediction on that?
I think when all is said and done, that the right forces are going to come together. I think that in a way they're going to find a way to, depending on the result of the election, either to secure the future or to do more under the current administration.
Oh, may that be true. Okay, thank you. All right, Nico, you really, along with ISW, have done some of the best work on the military situation in Ukraine. What's your assessment about the impact of the weapons package which have been announced around and at the summit on the battlefield?
Well, first of all, the weapons package that was announced was the repeated announcement of things that everybody knew already. And it's a bad habit partners of Ukraine are having, just repeatedly announcing the same military support to get some applause. But from announcing Patriot systems 5 times, the Patriot systems are not in Ukraine yet. And delivering Patriot systems since after the Children's Hospital has been bombed, unfortunately, is just the repetition of the pattern that we just described. So when will we deliver systems before something bad happens? That said, I think there are certain types of equipment and ammunitions that make a big difference on the battlefield in favor of Ukraine, especially the ATACMS, where I think, I agree with everything that has been said on the restrictions, but I think the center of gravity Ukraine needs to be enabled to push forward is Crimea. And we have seen that the use of ATACMS on Crimea, taking out sensors, radars, air defense systems, is changing the dynamics in that area. And the western part of the Black Sea and Crimea, and enabling Ukraine to do whatever is needed to put pressure there, I think should be our priority. And if you look into targeting air bases and bringing down bombers, some of those air bases are very far away. There is no weapon system in Ukraine yet delivered by partners that could strike air bases that are so far and so deep into Russian territory. So I would not get the hopes too high. The restrictions need to be lifted, but from a military point of view, this will not be a decisive difference that is made. There are overlooked elements that I want to mention from a military point of view that are really necessary. And that is, first and foremost, forward logistics and bringing maintenance and repair of mechanized equipment that we have delivered to Ukraine closer to the front lines. Open up the construction plans, allow Ukrainians to produce the spare parts and to implement the spare parts to tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, howitzers, directly there on the battlefield. In the end, deep strikes, drones, everything is extremely important, but in the end, we need to enable the Ukrainian armed forces to strike the Russian troops, but then to move forward, to breach, and to take back territory, and to beat the Russian forces on the territory of Ukraine. So maintenance and repair, forward logistics, I think that is absolutely necessary. And unfortunately, we did not see much on how to bring contractors in, how to move forward on those questions. I think this is, from a military point of view, essential. And the last point I want to mention is very self-critical. I know that there is now some who were very reluctant, including the German chancellor. They are now feeling somewhat comfortable in the spot. Look, we are buying our equipment from ourselves, delivering it to Ukraine, and this is great work we do to support Ukraine. But I think the next step needs to be to invest into Ukrainian manufacturers, to deliver components the Ukrainians need for their own drone and missile programs, and to find financial instruments to multiply the effort in Ukrainian industry. I think this will have a double effect. I mean, this is one element to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, which we badly need. But on the other hand, I think it will give Ukraine technological and industrial capabilities that are independent from the political up and downs and from the political tactical plays that we see in our countries. It is more sustainable if Ukrainian industry can produce for Ukraine than to wait for a package or for a supplemental and all of that all of the time. The fundamental decision has not been made by the main decision makers, unfortunately, here in the US and in Germany, but in also other countries as well. This is a war. We cannot debate the war somewhere. We cannot politically decide how the war is going. It is decided on the battlefield. And that is, I think, something where we need to decide, do we want to win or do we want to just slowly lose? At the moment, I think there is a big danger that we are slowly losing. So I mean, just getting your spine straight and say we want to win this, I think that is what the political decision makers need to do.
I think we would all agree with that. Okay, Kurt, last questions for you before we turn to audience Q&A. Many in Europe are nervous about our upcoming elections. Concerned that the U.S. policy of support for Ukraine, with all the flaws we've discussed today, may diminish if President Trump were to return to office. What do you expect from American policy towards Russia and Ukraine if there is a second Trump administration?
I'd say the first thing is we have a current situation where people are very unhappy, as we were just discussing, with the lack of U.S. commitment to a Ukrainian victory. And expectations are, under the current administration or a future Biden administration, that will continue. Then you have the prospect, what if it's not? What if it's a Trump administration? And there we have a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty. What would he do? He said he would end the war in 24 hours. He said he would end it even before he takes office. Nobody knows what that means. The only thing we can be pretty sure of is that it's not going to go that way, because Putin has no intention of ending the war in 24 hours, no matter what we do. So that's a problem. I come back to what Nico just said, what I said earlier. We need a strategy for winning the war. That has to be the priority, and we have to make every other decision around that objective. So what does it take to do that? There shouldn't be any restrictions on the use of weapons, because we should be governed by the purpose of winning the war, rather than by fears of what might happen. And I want to make one point related to that, which is one of the reasons we're governed by fear rather than governed by purpose is because we can't imagine Russia being anything other than a Putinist Russia. We just see this chaos, this threat, this danger facing all of us in the future. We have to not be afraid of change in Russia either. We have to aspire to seeing a peaceful Europe of which Russia's a part at some point. And that means we shouldn't be afraid. We should actually have purpose. Now, back to your question about Trump, I don't think he knows what he's going to do. I think a lot is going to depend on the situation at the time. A lot's going to depend on the people that he brings into an administration to work with him. The one hope that I have is that I think he looks at the current situation as a product of weakness, and therefore the remedy is to create a position of strength. And that's what Robert O'Brien put in his foreign affairs piece, which I think is more aspirational rather than projection of what Trump thinks. But nonetheless, I think that concept of peace through strength is the right concept to get back to.
Thank you. And Anna, you have a two-finger?
Yeah. Just a very short add-on to having a strategy to win against Russia. Finland, I just heard this the other day, having been on its own, preparing a possible aggression from Russia for a very long time, now a member of NATO. The major shift for the military there, as they tell me, is that, now we can prepare to win. Now we can prepare to win. A smaller country against an adversary like Russia does not prepare to win. Perhaps prepares to prevail, survive, muddle through in a way. But a strategy to win, we have to help Ukraine to do this. And if we don't do it as allies, because we don't include Ukraine into NATO, we really, really need to support Ukraine. We have to understand what Ukraine is up to, and I fear we don't understand this. I want to add it.
Thank you. Okay, audience questions. Actually, there's a microphone over here, so people should you can line up behind the microphone for our audience. And I'll start with someone from. Well, okay. Okay, that was very fast. Okay. First question we'll take from the audience, and please identify yourself.
Michael Washura, I'm with The Insider. This is a question not just for Ambassador Volker, but since the summit did not answer this question, let's say by the end of 2025, concretely, what does NATO need to do in order to ensure that the war ends and Ukraine wins? Concretely, and why aren't we doing that?
Well, what I would recommend, lift restrictions on types of weapons provided, lift restrictions on the use of weapons. We're still haggling over range of artillery. We're not even talking about aircraft, about A-10s, about helicopters. We should be lifting those restrictions. We should be assisting Ukraine directly with its air defense. We have the capability to do that from NATO territory and extend some coverage. It's what we did for Israel. There's no reason we shouldn't do it for Ukraine. We should be maintaining a consistent naval presence in the Black Sea to ensure freedom of navigation and to assist with maritime demining. There's no reason we should cede the Black Sea as a Russian lake governed by piracy. It makes no sense. We should be defining the pathway for Ukrainian NATO membership as quickly as possible. We should sit down in the NATO-Ukraine Council, start talking about Article 5. what it means, what's needed, how do we do this, rather than saying it's off on the other side of some bridge. We should start that process. We should close the loopholes in sanctions. Right now, the Russian banks are exempted from sanctions if payments are for energy. Well, this makes absolutely no sense. Energy sales are the principal source of revenue for Putin's war machine. So we have to close those loops. We should be increasing our own oil and gas production and working with other countries to do so to drive down global prices so that Putin is not able to gather as much money for his war machine. There are just a number of things to do that we should orient around that kind of strategy. And I think it is doable. I don't see any reason why we can't do this. So when you ask the question, why are we not doing it? I come back to what I said before. We're governed by fear. We're afraid of escalation. We're afraid of nuclear weapons. We're afraid of what political opponents of the administration might say. We're afraid of any number of things rather than being governed by the overriding purpose that we must have a victory here or else we're going to pay a higher price.
Thank you. Okay, I'll take a question from our virtual audience. This is from Hugo Rosemont. I think it's for you, Anna. How would you characterize the strength of the defense industry pledge made at the NATO Summit? And then, what are the highest priorities for industry support to Ukraine after this week?
Well, I think the pledge is a step forward because it focuses everyone on the need to do this. The components are fine, but I mean, we really need to move into action here. The proof is in the pudding, so to say, to fulfill this pledge. I think it's a good start, an important signal. Yeah. And the second question was?
What are the highest priorities for the industry after what happened this week? What should they be doing?
Well, I think, you know, get the ammunition going. It's still the highest priority in my regard, because we need to have that flow for ourselves, fill the stocks, and provide Ukraine. And that's fundamental back to the ammunition issue. I mean, this is lesson number one, I think, of this war.
Thank you.
If I can briefly just add about the industry, because we had some conversations during these days, it is still a problem that some countries are putting restrictions on transferring technologies to Ukraine, even of the very simple things. So, and it means the products themselves as well, not only the technology. Brits took off these restrictions. Americans, unfortunately, have a lot of restrictions yet. So the industry is struggling. They would like to work, they cannot. And the second is to involve the small and medium industry. So not only the big corporations that are producing weapons, because when you go to the drones, to the optics, to a lot of these innovation stuff, that is within the medium business, and they need support. They are ready to come, they are ready to take bigger risks than the big corporations, but they need the facilitation of the system.
Okay, thank you. Next question over here, and please identify yourself.
Hi, thank you for your time. My name's Bear Gruzin, and my question focused around international aid. And I was curious, after the recent bombing of the Children's Hospital in Ukraine, there's been an increasing need to reinforce critical health infrastructure. And I was curious, what other areas, other than defense, of Ukraine currently do you think international aid organizations should focus on helping, reinforcing, supplying? And yeah.
How do you want to try that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the hospitals, we know it. There is statistics, more than 400 hospitals around the country being destroyed by Russians, and they are constantly continuing doing it, saying that it is the military object. The second is schools, and that is where definitely we need the support. You can look to the projects like Save Ed, for example, who are doing tremendous work, because there are, destroyed schools. The second is the schools without shelters, and you need not just the underground, you need the conditions where to study for kids when they're in the shelters. And that is not only for the eastern regions, that is for the whole Ukraine, because with the air raids kids cannot study. Then we are speaking about the energy infrastructure, because it is now 90% of the Ukrainian production of energy being destroyed. And when it is no energy production, you understand how the small business, for example, are struggling, how all other systems others are struggling over there. You still have the necessity for the human rights organizations because there are such a big number of the war crimes that they just don't have capacity and people to document everything what is needed over there. And agriculture needs a lot of the support as well because they are lacking people, they are lacking the capacity for the demining, for the civilian demining. That's where a lot of organizations can go. I would say that probably now I cannot name one sphere where the support is not needed because Russians are targeting more and more the civilian objects, not the military objects. And here, even those who are supporting museums, you can go and help because Russians targeted so many museums, especially in the small towns, and they already been underfinanced, and now they're just struggling even how to save those things that they had in their collections, for example.
Okay, thank you. We have a question online, anonymous. Nico, I'll give it to you, but then Kurt may want to jump in as well. How does the West handle the increasing use by Russia of verbal threats of nuclear response to manipulate NATO behavior, Western population psyches, as well as the behavior of Western leaders?
Well, I think, to be honest, I think we got better in this. I see more understanding, even with policymakers that were very afraid of Russian nuclear threats before, that this is a form of psychological warfare, and that the escalation risk is just stressed to play on fear in population. So I do not really see that as a main problem at the moment. But I would say, in the framework of building a strategy towards winning in Ukraine and bringing Ukraine into NATO at the same time, we have to have an intellectual, conceptual debate over this nuclear cloud and what possible responses are. I think there is something like nuclear illiteracy with many policymakers these days. They are not used to this and to the specific discussions around nuclear issues.
You mean nuclear illiteracy?
Yeah. So to have some more education and some more intellectual debates around these issues and how to respond to what. I'm mentioning this because one of the sideline decisions of this NATO summit was, and I think it's 6 years too late, but still good, that there will be intermediary range American cruise missiles posted in Germany, Tomahawk and others, to contradict the threat that is coming from Iskander and nuclear warheads that are in Kaliningrad Oblast in Russia. So I mean, that just demonstrates that we need to have a new discussion on this, because when the Tomahawk decision came into the German public, there was a very, very, let's say, beginner level discussion about nuclear issues, and so there is a necessary work when it comes to this.
Well, I'm old enough to remember the introduction of INF into Europe by Reagan in the early 80s, and the fuss that created. Kurt, please.
Very quickly, a rare disagreement with Nico. I think that the threat of nuclear weapons continues to be a factor in decision-making, particularly in Washington, that makes the priority avoiding escalation rather than the priority winning. And that is because, for the reason that you said, we have nuclear illiteracy. Nuclear weapons exist, and therefore we have to deter their use. And you deter strategic use by threatening strategic use, and you deter tactical use by threatening it to attack the forces that use them. You don't even have to use nuclear weapons to do that. And we have to send very clear signals. We will not tolerate any use of nuclear weapons or the use of blowing up a power plant that could be the effect of a dirty bomb. We will not tolerate that. And getting that across is the way that we should deal with those kinds of nuclear threats.
I'm glad you made that comment, because I was just about to ask the question, if in fact the nuclear fear was behind us, why weren't we declaring a policy of victory? Okay, last question from here, and again, identify yourself.
Ilya Zaslavsky with NGO Razum We Stand. I'm glad, thank you, the panel, for the discussion. I'm glad that energy sanctions came up. I wouldn't call them loopholes, probably more like open floodgates. In 1 week, Russia gets money from Europe enough to pay for those 40 missiles sent earlier this week. And overall, since the beginning of full-scale war, Europe alone paid $200 billion for Russian fossil fuels, and the world in general, $700 billion. So with one hand, we're giving this much money, and supplemental and everything else pales in comparison. So what do we do about this schizophrenic approach in terms of Russian fossil fuels? Thank you.
You want to take this?
Well, I said it earlier.
Right.
We need to close the sanctions loopholes. We need to increase oil and gas production ourselves. Reverse the ban on LNG licensing from the United States. Drive down global prices as much as we can. Seek allies who are also capable of increasing production with that in effect. Because we need to recognize that it is exactly the energy industry that is fueling Russia's war.
And that is why Ukraine is striking refineries, because
Yes.
if there is steel production and selling, we are not striking the extraction, so we are not influencing the prices. But the refineries, that is from where the added value and the additional revenue is.
Your campaign has been brilliant and very effective, despite hesitation from certain quarters in this town. Okay, with that, thank you very much to the panel for an excellent discussion. Thank you all for coming, and there will be a lot more in the future from here.